the most fearsome fighters in all of ancient Greece, a society that existed with a singular purpose to create the most effective warriors possible, notable for their courage, austere lifestyle, and from today's perspective, insane and absolutely cruel rituals. So, let's take a look at what life was like for a Spartan at the peak of their power in the 5th century BC. The reality is that we know very little about Sparta prior to the 400s BC. There are speculations that a few hundred years in the past they were just a regular Greek city-state, nothing out of the ordinary, and that it was wars that forced them to create their fabled set of laws and their militaristic society. The way their culture was structured was very unique and out of the ordinary at the time. They were an oligarchy with 2 hereditary kings and with some democratic elements, if they can be called that. As chief leaders of state, kings dealt with almost all elements: religious, military, and judicial. The civil and the criminal cases were decided upon by a group of officials known as the Ephors and the Council of Elders known as the Gerousia. The system was best described by Aristotle as the kingship of Sparta being unlimited and perpetual generalship. Kings were supposed to be moral examples for the people, and they could actually be overthrown if there was a reason to do so. The reality is that they didn't really hold all that much power, even though they seemingly did. Usually, one king would go on a war campaign while the others tended to the matters at home, but at all times they were observed by the Ephors. Still, at one point in history, they didn't even have the power to declare wars themselves, and they had to consult with the Ephors, who really had the most power. Now, Ephors could summon the king, questioning them about their wrongdoing, and could even get rid of them. Now, of course, this does seem to give them absolute power, but the catch was that after their term in office was over for the Ephors, they would just go into political obscurity while the kings remained noble, so they didn't really want to constantly incur their wrath. Nonetheless, kings were put on trials many times. To keep matters simple, it was a complex power structure that resembled a democracy, but it wasn't really a democracy. Unlike the Athenians that loved debate, Spartans despised rhetoric. From a young age, they were trained to speak as little as possible, and when done so, they were supposed to say much in as few words as possible. They were taught to obey their superiors and not to constantly outwit them. Spartan society consisted of 3 classes: citizens, non-citizens known as the Periki, and the slaves, helots. The daily life of each of these groups was a night and day difference. In terms of the citizens, until the Hellenistic period, Spartan military was the only professional Greek army. The citizens were the main fighting force, and literally their only purpose was to do battle. If they weren't fighting, they were preparing to fight. Every male infant was examined by the Gerousia, the Council of Elders, to determine whether the baby was fit. Women would bathe the babies in wine to test how they would respond and to toughen them. If they didn't pass the test, they were placed at the base of Mount Aegetus for several days to see if they will survive. The parents themselves didn't have much say in the matter, and the babies were seen more as children of Sparta rather than the children of their own parents. At the age of 7, they were enrolled in the Agogi, over a decade-long brutal training, and the only way to actually become a citizen of the state, aside from a very few exceptions. When they got into the training, early rituals were there to just toughen up the children. They would go barefoot, they weren't allowed to sleep much, they were deprived of water and food. Bullying was also encouraged from the older boys in order to mentally toughen up the younger ones. They were taught reading and writing, of course only the bare minimum, and they always trained in groups. After they go through the initial period, at the age 12, their heads were shaven, they lived in a barracks, and they only had a single red cloak for all kinds of weather. This was, of course, incredibly harsh in the cold Spartan winter, but they were forced to endure it. To add to that, the boys also took daily baths in the ice-cold river, of course, once again to toughen themselves up. From the age of 18 to 20, they were marshaled into a huge school and were taught hoplite warfare, more as in tactics and the actual military stuff. The elders in many cases had sexual relationships with the younger initiates, as sexuality was seen in an entirely different context in the ancient world when compared to today. This time-constrained relationship was done to promote attachment and to give the military formation a boost. After the initiates turned 20 and had completed their training, they could grow their hair long as well as as their beard, but a mustache was always to be shaven, although we don't have strict sources for this. The point of all this training and discipline was to create invincible warriors, as the Spartan ideal for a man was to be courageous in battle and to stand his ground and give his life no matter the cost. It was also done to promote group cohesion. Losing a shield was the worst dishonor for a Spartan, as it did not only protect him, but the entire unit. With this in mind, the structure of the formation was always a bigger priority than the life of an individual Spartan. So, what would a male citizen do once he completed his training? Well, not much really, as duty was so instilled in them that the entire city was built like a barracks. They always had something to do. If it was not training, it was overseeing the youth, helping, or in some way serving their nation. They could strive to become ephors or part of the Council of Elders or even the king's bodyguards. Getting married was one of the things usually done between 20 and 30, and it was incredibly contradictory to say the least. On one hand, the state wanted to promote families and they wanted more men, but on the other, they wanted the soldier to stay in the barracks and to control himself. So a young couple after getting married could barely see each other, and the soldier would have to sneak out to see his wife on very rare occasions within the first few years. This was done to preserve their fertility as well as to strengthen their willpower. While they held land, Spartan homes were incredibly simple. Only axe and saw were used to build furniture, and there were no big intricacies involved. This was done to promote the austere lifestyle. In fact, that is what their entire society was about, creating a utopia in a very strict way to promote equality and to not have one member hold more wealth than the other. They even went as far as using iron ingots for money just for the citizens, so they could never purchase foreign goods or really do much with their wealth because no one wanted to use iron. Nonetheless, some inequality still slipped through the cracks, as there was definitely some richer men that could breed horses and that could compete at the Olympic Games. Citizens could never go abroad unless they had very strict state instructions, and foreigners needed a really good reason to enter Sparta, as they feared they would corrupt the virtue of their citizens. In terms of food, Spartans loved hunting wild boars. They appreciated nutritious food, but generally ate small portions. They also drank wine in strict moderation. On occasions, they would force the slaves to drink a ton of wine, causing them to act mindlessly and foolishly so that they could not only laugh at them and feel superior, but they could also show the younger ones why they shouldn't drink in excess. In terms of female citizens, they had a very unique position within their society. Female babies weren't subjected to the same scrutiny as the males, but they still had their roles. In Spartan society, the primary purpose of a woman was to give birth, and not just give birth to anyone, but to warriors. This role was so greatly respected that dying on childbirth was as great an honor as dying on the battlefield. Women were expected to constantly exercise and to compete in sports in order to remain strong and to give birth to strong children. However, in terms of freedom, their position was quite different to the other city-states. As opposed to Athens, where a woman didn't even have a say in pretty much anything and was married off at an incredibly young age, Spartan women were married off around 18 to 20, and they were literate, which was incredibly rare in the ancient world, and they were also able to move freely. At the same time, women in most cases actually were in charge of the house, as their husband was usually off on his duty. So they controlled the finances and had some economic power. This was criticized by other Greeks, as while the men were subjected to incredible discipline and a strict life, women didn't get half of that, resulting in critics seeing this as degenerative to their society and the state. Additionally, the women weren't so strict as depicted by the famous Athenian myth, with your shield or on it, where they would discard their children if they failed in battle. First off, Spartans generally buried the dead near the battlefield and they didn't even bring them back, and second, if they returned without a shield, they would see this as cowardice and they would have them shave half of their beard and wear a patch count for cloak and would lose a lot of their rights, but they weren't like completely exiled. So far, almost all of these customs are about citizens, which were actually a minority within Sparta, there were also the freemen, non-citizens, and the slaves. The freemen, Periki, had a strange role. They weren't enslaved, but they also didn't enjoy full citizen rights. They served a role in military reserve to be used in battle whenever necessary, and as agents of industry, craftsmanship, as well as foreign trade. The Periki never revolted, and due to this unique role, they were actually much richer on certain occasions than the citizens, because the citizens used the iron ingots, while the Periki could use gold and all the foreign currencies. Now, the last and the lowest class were the Helots, slaves. Slaves did all the manual labor, they provided for the soldier and his family, and only kept what was left for themselves. They were free to practice their religion and marry, but their position was beyond terrible. They rebelled on many occasions, and they absolutely despised the Spartans with all their hearts. Helots were subject to state-sponsored humiliation and repression, and at times, the citizens were free to hunt them and kill them without any repercussions. The secret police were also spying on them constantly and would pick off certain targets, especially those that stood out as stronger with their physique than the rest, and therefore they could potentially be more dangerous. At one point, there were 7 Helots for every citizen, and they constantly feared the rebellions, and eventually the Helots would be their undoing. Ultimately, Sparta's power began to decline in the 4th century, and after Alexander the Great and the Roman conquests, they essentially just faded into obscurity. The main reason was their lack of manpower. After a single devastating battle, it would take them decades to recuperate their numbers, and their incredibly strict wedding processes for children didn't alleviate this problem in any way. While they possessed the most feared and deadly warriors in the ancient world, they were never successful as an empire, mainly due to their exclusivity. On the other hand, Romans were the direct opposite, and they prided themselves on their multiculturalism and inclusivity as they incorporated half of the world's cultures into their own, which granted them a great manpower pool. So, while the Spartans had the best warriors, the Romans had the best army in the ancient world. Thank you for watching. Check out what life was like for an ancient Athenian by clicking on the screen, and also check out the Instagram page for daily facts on history and science. See you next time.